We're getting ready to celebrate the grand opening of Longfellow Park. This project really illustrates what can happen when you collaborate. We've got AARP, CPAC, BRAC, the city, DPW, all at the table trying to make this whole entire area a better place.
Get up and do some exercise or something here. My name is Flozell Daniels, Jr., and I'm the CEO of the Foundation for Louisiana. We are a statewide social justice philanthropy who makes an effort to invest in people and practices that make our communities stronger, more sustainable, and equitable. And I am absolutely delighted to be a part of this amazing conversation about cities and the critical role they play in building resilience. I am born and raised native of New Orleans and am just in love with that city and the incredible role that cities play in developing culture and strength and opportunity for our families across the entire state of Louisiana. And today we're going to be having this conversation and really trying to set the context for what it means to strengthen our cities. We're going to really be talking about that context from the perspective, for instance, of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which reminded us this past October that we have little over a decade to drastically reduce greenhouse emissions to avoid catastrophic climate change. The same week, the Trump administration acknowledged that there will be a 7-degree Fahrenheit increase by 2100 in global temperatures. And of course, we know the primary effects of these temperature increases and increases in drought, sea level rise, forest fires, as we're seeing with our friends in California and other places, and of course, more frequent and intense storms are the things that we work day in and day out on. But in addition to that, the effects that have really brought concern to us with regard to agriculture, fisheries, the negative impact on food production, vector-borne diseases that will increase with temperature increases, and of course, the ever difficult climate-forced migration of people, the likes of which that we haven't seen in recent history. We're already seeing these things in Louisiana with regard to all of the after effects of Katrina and Rita, the BP oil spill, the relocation of some of our neighbors and people, and the work that we're looking forward to. So these are the impacts that we're trying to avoid, and they're also the impacts that really talented and thoughtful folks like you are planning for. And so we know that we have to make rapid and far-reaching transitions to renewable energies, reconsider land use practices, and really rethink our urban and infrastructure design to avoid surpassing some of the challenges that before us. And today we are really privileged to have an amazing panel to help us answer some of these questions in the context of cities, looking at not only what the challenges are, but what are specifically some of the solutions that we can look forward to and begin to practice when we leave this amazing summit. So I'm going to introduce everyone, and then we'll go back and have some brief presentations by each of the panelists, and then we're going to have a conversation. While we're doing this, I'm really hoping you're taking notes and thinking about how you want to engage in this conversation. We'll have a little Q&A at the end, and we're also hoping for you to be engaged by way of solutions. Popcorn style, if you are thinking about ways to engage and help us move on some of the solutions, please do so. So first we have Joseph Kohl. Joseph was among the founders who in 1987 established the firm that became Dover, Kohl and Partners. Together they have developed a successful public design process, combining cutting-edge visualization techniques with community participation strategies. Joe is recognized nationally as an innovator in urban design and graphic communication. He oversees the firm's urban design, working hands-on with the town planners to refine and constantly improve designs for walkable, sustainable urban places. Welcome, Joe. Thanks for being here with us. Next, we have Chris Forinash. Chris connects people to the places they love by making the ways they get around easier, healthier, and more sustainable. Chris has nearly 25 years working in urban transportation and development and contributed to early work on recognizing the environmental benefits of smart growth and is renowned for interpreting technical results legibly for policymakers and the public. Chris approaches all of his work by engaging with the community, analyzing their needs and options, and recommending innovative and practical changes. And he has brought his talents to bear by serving as chair of the Arlington County Planning Commission, having accelerated their move into being a more vibrant urban community. Thank you, Chris, for being here with us. Next, Katie Wholey. Did I get that right, Katie?
You did.
Yeah. Katie is a resilience consultant and urban planner in Arup's Boston office, specializing in climate risk and resilience, sustainability, and post-disaster recovery. Katie works to evaluate complex design and policy challenges and provide forward-thinking solutions to long-term planning for climate resilience and sustainability. In her prior work, she worked with New York Rising, focused on developing innovative policy solutions and strategies for housing recovery in the wake of Superstorm Sandy. Thank you, Katie, for joining us. And last, we have Mark Goodson, principal with CSRS's resilience practice, who oversees a multidisciplinary team of professionals who advise their clients on how to survive, adapt, and thrive during changing conditions. He is a representative in the 100 Resilient Cities organization, and CSRS is one of the organization's platform partners. It's focused on resilience, urban planning, and redevelopment, finance, and program management. Thanks for being here with us. We're going to start back at the end here with regard to this presentation, and we'll work our way through.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Joseph Kohl, and as mentioned, I work with Victor Dover at Dover Kohl and Partners, and we love doing what we do, and I hope to keep doing it. Advance the slide. The green button, the big green button. Aha. Okay. So this image is actually a cartoon of what we hope doesn't happen to the island. That is, forgot the name. Not Key West, Key Largo. Jeez. So we hope this is not what happens to Key Largo, obviously. But this is a cartoon of what may happen if we do nothing over the next 100 years, maybe 200 years. As you know, it's hard to get a real answer as to how fast the sea is going to come up. But that's what it looks like today. It has a lot of people that live there and work there and shop there and go snorkeling there. And so one of the key strategies we've been working on in Southeast Florida is what can we do? And unlike in Louisiana, we can't build levees and have them be effective because the coral rock underneath our ground is called oolitic limestone. So it's old ancient coral reefs, very porous. So you could pour things on top of it to build a levee, but the water will just simply go underneath unless you do something more drastic, which they talk about from time to time, which is something like drilling holes into the ground and pouring concrete. And of course, who knows what that could affect, how that could affect the marine life. So if you look kind of in the middle there, where right now we've got one-story strip shopping center type buildings, one strategy would be basically what they call the retreat strategy. And that would be, let's take those areas with a lot of underutilized land and intensify them. So maybe that means there's multifamily there now getting built or mixed use. And at the same time, you could be perhaps raising the ground up, but basically kind of fortifying that center of town. So that then when the eventuality does come and people can no longer live in the lower lying areas if that boundary is not expanded, then you've got something where you could have the same number of people on less land. So similarly in Jean-Lafitte, just south of New Orleans, where we worked on a master plan there as well, a similar strategy, a long linear city, all along that finger of one of the canals from the Mississippi. And so there they had areas where you could basically create the centers. In fact, one has the town hall and the library, et cetera. And so this was a cartoon showing the community how they could use that as their approach for perhaps the inevitable, given that the city was so long with a lot of barrier that you can't connect. So, this has happened before. We're not this is not the first era in human civilization where we've been confronted with this. Galveston raised their center of town 100 years ago. This is what it looked like after the hurricane. And then you can see here they took on the project of raising the level of the ground. And so what they did is they had the utility poles there. You can see they marked where the eventual ground level was going to be. And I think the property owners were told by a certain date, either raise your house or build your new house, since there was so much destruction, up to this level, and that's where the city's going to be. So here you can see the roads. You can actually see them laying I would imagine those are sewer lines. So maybe the ground was going up a little bit higher than from that point on. But it's been done before, but through a very concerted, cooperative effort by everyone. And in places like Chicago, they were raising masonry structures, again, 100 years ago, where it took physical manual labor, hundreds of guys cranking these jacks to lift up these buildings. And it must have been very entertaining for the wealthy folks there. We can see strolling around watching it. And then, this is kind of what we see more today. A new building gets built, or somebody gets the desire to raise up their building. And this is a non-coordinated effort, I think. And so then we always ask ourselves as urban designers, how's this going to affect the character of the neighborhood? Or when you've got some houses up and some houses down, it's not really that pretty or attractive. And then and in some cases, this looks like it's a fairly affordable home. So if there's an elderly person in there, how do they paint the building when it needs to be painted? Or how do you fix a little something on the corner of the house when it's 21 feet up above the ground? I think it's problematic. I have a couple cartoons here because one idea is that we could be building buildings today that then could somehow be adaptable later on. So this is a cartoon that basically shows the same building. You don't have to raise it 100 years from now, but it should be built in such a way that maybe the second floor could be removed. And then what was the second floor becomes the third floor or first floor as you just keep filling. Because a likely approach, and certainly what we're seeing in Miami Beach, where the city is just simply coming through and elevating the roadways. So you can see on the far right there, you can see the little black lines, which are the former roads, the pavement of the roads that have been added to over time. So this is a strategy that is not really getting seriously looked at, I don't think. I think the main reason is because the people who are building taller buildings, for example, this is in Miami Beach was where we were showing this. They're building really tall buildings in Miami Beach right now. And those will probably, as the sea comes up, if the ground doesn't get raised, they'll be there in some form. They may not be usable if they don't have good infrastructure in place, but the city's intention is to make that work. But the extra cost associated with making a building adaptable for a purpose sometimes in the future is far beyond the economic driver of building the buildings. The contractor or the builder's going to sell all the units and then go to the next building. There's really no interest in putting in that extra money because for them the value is for a future property owner. So, and that's my segment.
Thanks, Joe. Again, I'm Chris Forinash from Nelson Nygaard Transportation Planning Consultants. I just want to say this is probably the third or fourth time I've had the privilege of coming for the Louisiana Smart Growth Summit. It's always terrific for me. My family moved to Louisiana 40 years ago next month, and I get to always visit my mama when I come down. So, and all 4 of her children left the state after getting our high school educations, and that's part of the problem, and I'm very happy to be able to come back occasionally and hopefully contribute to some of the solutions. So my topic, or my part of our panel today, is to talk about the transportation part of infrastructure. And I want to highlight that the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in this country is from the transportation sector. It's not from the building sector. It's not from the industrial sector. It's from the transportation sector. And the biggest contributor to transportation emissions is personal vehicles. So we have to reduce our reliance on personal vehicles, on cars. And electric vehicles are not going to solve the problems for us, and as I'll get to later, autonomous vehicles are not going to solve the problems in our cities. So here's the planner's vision of the future. This is some work we did with Lyft and Perkins & Will Architects to reimagine Wilshire Boulevard in Los Angeles. I'll come back to that in a minute. So that's what planners show. I'm an engineer by training, so you get some words on this slide. I want to highlight that resilience, and we've heard this throughout all the presentations and discussions, resilience is about people. It's the people systems that have to function well before we can have the political will for our infrastructure to function well and to be updated to be more adaptable to climate change. And to put people first, we have to, and this has been hard for the transportation industry, we have to connect to community values, not the values of transportation engineers, but the values of the people who live in the communities and use the transportation systems. That's safe mobility, that's quality places, that's equitable access. I'll come back to those themes a little bit in my few minutes here. Priorities for cities have to be protecting your right-of-way. The right-of-way is, the transportation right-of-way is the largest chunk of publicly owned land in any city. It's way larger than parks or schools. The street right-of-way is the largest piece of land that the city owns, and making the best use of it is our highest imperative, or should be. That involves, or that requires, better management of that right-of-way, right-sizing our assets. We heard from Jason in the last presentation of the last session, inspiring ideas of how to show people, as you've done on Government Street, what's possible within existing right-of-ways. Let me also point out that more and more places, including Rochester, New York, a place that we don't think of as a thriving, booming metropolis, has recently torn down a large section of their urban freeway loop and replaced it with surface streets and newly developable land. If it can happen in Rochester, New York, it can happen in Baton Rouge. And then I'll come back a little bit to our future, our autonomous future. This one keeps me humble, right? This is a 1964 vision of a wonderful future. It's the future General Motors wanted us to have, and I have to say they got the future they wanted, but the rest of us really didn't. You don't have to read this. This is just an example of when we connect with people and learn from them what they prioritize about their community and have that inform our transportation planning, that's the way it works. And increasingly, connecting with people, of course, as we've all said, does not mean large public meetings. It does not mean sitting in rooms like this. It means reaching the most vulnerable users of our transportation systems, because we all travel around, including children, including the elderly, including the disabled, and including people who don't have easy access to cars. And so reaching those folks and really learning from them what they prioritize and what they need is the most important foundational step of our work. Urban transportation cannot be driven by ideology, but it has to be driven by geometry. We've all seen versions of this by now, right? We've gone back, this is the original inspired picture developed in Munster, Germany in the 1970s. On the left, that's what it looks like. That's the space required to move 60 people, one person per vehicle. In the center, 60 people in one bus. On the right, 60 people in their bikes. We've all seen versions of this. We understand that efficient use of our limited right-of-way is the key to a sustainable urban transportation system. This graphic really illustrates that what we do with our right-of-way really translates into mobility. There's also a placemaking function that our streets need to serve, but in terms purely of mobility, from the top you see private motor vehicles, a lane can move 600 to 1,600 private motor vehicles per hour. All the way down at the bottom, a similar amount of right-of-way of width can serve up to 25,000 people, purely from the mobility function in transit vehicles. I'll come back to that when I revisit Wilshire Boulevard Boulevard as a design example in Los Angeles in a minute. In fact, in a second, because here's Wilshire Boulevard on the left, and this is a 120-foot right-of-way. It's an ample right-of-way. It's an ample right-of-way that currently is 10 lanes of traffic and 2 relatively narrow sidewalks that can, again, just as a mobility function, a conventional transportation function, move almost 30,000 people an hour. Reimagine that space in the future. Those center lanes are dedicated for high-capacity transit, and by the way, that's likely autonomous bus rapid transit. That's the Twin Towers in the middle, the 2 highest capacity lanes on that street in that future configuration. On the outside are the sidewalks that have been increased in width and can accommodate several thousand more people per hour. And the other lanes, the gray ones, are for private vehicles or autonomous vehicles, as the case may be, and the green ones for bikes. And now that same 120-foot right-of-way can move 77,000 people an hour. That's about moving people. What about the curb space? We're seeing increasing pressure, excuse me, on the curb space and how the curb space is managed in our cities. As, I don't know if you know this, but Uber Eats now does in more deliveries than Uber delivers people in some urban areas. So food delivery, right. And if you think Uber hasn't recognized that, then you're mistaken. They're very good at analyzing the data. So actively managing the curb space in our cities is where the action is right now, because we have increasing pickup and drop-off demands on those curbs. We have, of course, transit vehicle access, drop-off and pickup, as we have had for years. We have an increased demand for on-street parking. Will that be the case in the future when more vehicles are autonomous? And as others have noted, that's where the greening can happen in the street space as well. So we're working with cities increasingly to formalize how they manage that curb space and how they price that curb space in a way that encourages the proper uses at the proper times of day. This is just an example of how the prioritization of curb access differs by the kind of context you're going through. In a purely residential context, the modal plan, in this case the street plan, might designate that it's primarily for residential vehicle access. In a commercial and mixed-use access, the modal plan might prioritize transit or bikes, and then decreasing priority down the table. But autonomous vehicles will save us, right? Well, as you can tell, I love visions of yesterday's tomorrows. So we're not the first generation to think about what autonomous vehicles might be like. But it's less likely to be playing board games with your family and more likely to be absorbing advertising from Waymo, the most advanced autonomous vehicle company right now, which is, of course, owned by Google, which makes 96% of their income from advertising. So let's look at this. How much, I said earlier, geometry is destiny. This is a version of that same graphic. On the left, 60 people in their personally owned vehicles. In the middle, 60 people, 1 per Uber. On the right, 60 people, 1 per autonomous vehicle. That's the geometric facts. For autonomous vehicles to pay off in terms of decreasing urban congestion, they're going to have a lot more than 1 people per vehicle, or 0 people per vehicle, which is what many autonomous vehicles will have if we don't have shared autonomy in the future. So one last and very sobering note. We've seen almost a 50% increase in pedestrian fatalities from motor vehicle accidents since 2009. Almost 50%. We know that autonomous vehicles are not now and will not soon be at a point where they can completely, efficiently, and reliably avoid killing people. In fact, there was a recent survey in the news a couple of weeks ago specifically asking people, okay, who do you think in this situation, whose life should we sacrifice? These are decisions that programmers are making. We need our citizens to be making them. If robots won't save the bipeds, otherwise known as humans, who will? I'll just put in this endorsement that transportation engineers and planners can be and have to be part of those solutions. And I am with a transportation planning consulting firm, not coincidentally. Again, Chris Forinash, thank you very much for your time.
Hi everyone, I'm Katie Wholey. I am a consultant with Arup, and for those of you who are not familiar, Arup's a global planning, design, and engineering firm. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the tools that we can use to actually start designing for resilience. So on the one hand, we need to think big and have transformative policy changes. I was in the workshop yesterday where we're talking about maybe prohibiting slab on grade in floodplains and things like that that state legislature can start thinking about. But at the same time, we're also designing today the future of our cities. We're building buildings and infrastructure that are going to last 30, 50, 100 years, and we need to really start acting now to start thinking about some of these challenges. So I'm just going to talk about a few of the tools that we're using at Arup with some of our clients to start building resilience into the designs that we're designing today. So the first one is a program called the Resilience Shift. It's a 5-year program with the Lloyd's Register Foundation, who funded it, and Arup is managing it. And it's really to start thinking about critical infrastructure as a system that really drives how your city functions. It's not just a singular asset, it's a system that make sure that you can function under any sort of circumstances. And we are helping connect practitioners to developers of tools and really help them figure out, get the funding and the expertise to develop tools that will help them implement resilience throughout the life cycle of the critical infrastructure that they're designing, from planning and design through operations and maintenance. And what are the tools that you really need to be able to implement resilience, with the ultimate outcome of hopefully creating a platform at the end of these 5 years where all of these tools will be publicly available to anyone who wants to use them, and we'll create a community where your practitioners can talk to each other, but also they can access all of these tools. They won't be proprietary to a certain firm or city. It's all publicly available. The second tool I want to talk about is a system called WeatherShift, and it really takes the IPCC data, that's our best climate science, and it allows you to downscale it to what an engineer needs to design buildings and infrastructure more resiliently. So, if the data tells us that rainfall is going to increase by 5% annually every year, that doesn't mean a lot to an engineer. The example I like to use is of a civil engineer designing a highway. What they need to design the drainage system is really hourly rainfall data. And right now we base that data on past data and past examples of rainfall, not future rainfall. So this is just an example of a highway project where we're looking at the 50-year return period for a rainstorm. And this would be, the blues showing that the drainage systems are designed the way they should be. They meet federal highway standards for safety, and everything's fine based on the past 50-year storm event. However, if you then change the input, don't change how you're designing, just change the input of the rainfall, and you look at a 50-year storm at the end of the century, you're now seeing runoff crossing highway lanes, which is a major safety issue and does not meet federal highway standards. And by just changing that input, our engineers were able to identify 4 additional inlets that need to be put in the roadway, and also that those should be increased from 24 inches to 48 inches. So they can, working in all of the systems that they already have in place and just changing the input, they can start to design differently today with the projects that are ongoing. The other thing I want to talk about, and one of the biggest challenges we see, is communicating the value of resilience. So this is just an example of a quick exercise we did looking at a traditional office building versus a more resilient office building, where you're elevating equipment, mechanical, electrical systems out of the flood-prone areas, and then looking at what is the value of under a 1 foot, a 3 foot, and an 8 foot flood. What is the cost that you would invest to make that building more resilient up front versus the damages that you would save if a 1 foot, a 3 foot, or an 8 foot flood in this scenario were to impact that building? So you could save anywhere between approximately $3 to $11 per dollar invested up front. And this was just a quick exercise that we did for a project where we were having trouble convincing, the CEO and the leadership that this is something you should really be thinking about, and they wanted to hear it in dollar terms. The next one I'm going to talk about is actually moving beyond just the damage to the buildings, but starting to think about the economic value. So This is actually an example for earthquake resilience, but it's looking at the downtime after an event. So it's not just the damage to your building and your infrastructure, but also the cost of lost business revenue and how long it really takes for you to get back up and running after an event. After Katrina, the floods here, Superstorm Sandy, we all know that realistically you're not going to be back up and running in a week, a month, sometimes even a year or longer. So what is the actual cost to your business and your economy, and how do you start to bring all of those costs together to really understand the value of investing up front? And then the last example I wanted to show is actually looking at the equity angle of all of this. And this is just a research project. It's not an actual project that we've implemented, but it's one of my colleagues, Jack Hogan, and a graduate student at the Harvard GSD, Emily Marsh, who started to look at how can you change the traditional way that we value projects to include an equity angle. So this is just an example of, say you had two levies that you're doing a cost-benefit analysis on. One would protect a lower income area and one would protect a higher income area. The traditional way you value that, you would look at the cost of the levy plus the losses that would be avoided. The higher income area is always going to be the clear winner because there's more value in the real estate in that area, so there's more to protect. So that first one shows, the top half of that box shows that levy B protects the higher income area. It's a $15 million in net benefit versus $5 million for levy A if you do it the traditional way. What they looked at is looking at the marginal utility of a dollar. So basically, the cost or the value of a dollar to a lower income population is a lot higher than the value of a dollar to a higher income population. So how do you create a weighting factor that captures that value and then applying that to your traditional cost benefit analysis? So again, you're using the same system, but just tweaking it a little bit and looking at both levies from that perspective with that equity weighting included, you're actually going to come out that the levy that protects the lower income area would be the better investment. So kind of just using the system on top of the transformative changes, we need to start thinking about what are the ways that we can tweak the things we're already doing to start implementing resilience today for these systems that aren't going to be in place for a long time.
Good afternoon. I'm Mark Goodson with CSRS. We're based right here in Baton Rouge. And as a former CPEXer in Baton Rouge, I'm always proud to be part of this event and grateful for the exchange of information that happens here. It's a lot of fun to come here and learn new things and meet new people and just be part of it. So thanks again for having me. You've heard a lot of provocative and great ideas and exciting new tools. And one of the really neat things about, the resilience movement, if you will, is to see the traction that it's getting and see more and more communities, understanding that they need to think about and manage risks differently. They need to change the way that they're doing things in order to continue to survive and thrive well into the future. But oftentimes, those discussions stop at, okay, but how do I actually get this done? And not to oversimplify it, but a lot of times that means, how do I pay for it? Okay, a lot of the thinking around resilience building activities and investments is innovative, and it's stuff that we haven't done, or it's doing things different from the way that we've done them in the past. And so, a lot of the prevailing train of thought is that a lot of the conventional ways of paying for things don't fit that mold. Because it's supposedly out of the box. Sometimes that's true, but a lot of times it's just sort of retuning the way that we currently do things, baking in resilience in order to get those resilience building investments implemented. And so I'm going to spend a few minutes just giving some kind of examples of that process. I'll go ahead and say my slides will be a lot less sexy than anybody else's or that you've seen, a lot more sort of process oriented, but hopefully they'll be clear and helpful to you as we sort of think through this together. So, our firm has boiled the practice of resilience, I should say, down into really a three-step process. One is identifying and understanding your risks and vulnerabilities. Then it is developing strategies to mitigate or reverse those vulnerabilities or risks. Those two things together we call resilience planning. And then the third step is then building and running programs to implement those strategies or projects. And a lot of times, for us as consultants, that ends up in program management. But it's helpful to us, at least, to understand the practice of resilience in that process, to be able to sort of take it incrementally and be ready for the next step. So, how do we pay for resilient outcomes? That is the question. And there's really two ways to do it. Spend your money differently than you are currently, or go find new money from somewhere else. When you talk about spending your money differently, a lot of times, and I'm talking mostly about government here, it's about reprioritizing the way that things should perform, or you evaluate the performance of investments or assets. And that is good old strategic planning. It starts with what are our resilience goals? What are the actions then to achieve those goals? What are the metrics that we're going to use to measure the success of those actions? And then what are the key performance indicators are we going to use to evaluate the performance overall towards our resilience goals, and building that into your decision-making process when it comes to funding and financing in your capital planning process. We're working now with the city of Boulder, Colorado. They're a member city of 100 Resilient Cities, which is an organization I would invite you all to check out if you're not familiar with them. And they have a resilience strategy. One of the things that they've struggled is how do we institutionalize sort of our budgeting and capital planning processes to ultimately deliver the resilience outcomes that we've said we want in our strategy. And so it starts with just mapping those things out and then building that into a performance-based funding system. On the other side, finding new money from somewhere else can actually mean two things. One, it's either generating new savings or finding new revenue or generating new revenue. On the new savings side, there are a few ways that can be achieved. Again, speaking mostly for governments here. One is in efficiencies. How can we do what we're already doing better and therefore cheaper? Privatization. Can we provide the same service or benefit, or it maybe even do better if we let somebody else do it and save money in the process? And then third, reduce risk. By reducing risk, I'm avoiding loss and the costs associated with that, but there are also, sort of follow-on ripple effect savings that can also happen, like lower insurance premiums. Those savings, if you know they're coming, can be monetized up front to pay for things in advance. There are also new revenue sources. Most of these are going to be, familiar to you. New fees, new taxes, conventional financing, asset recycling or public-private partnership. It's taking an asset that, a government has that has value and bringing that value to the market instead of just holding it sort of dormant. Things like airports or roads or parks, things that otherwise someone else sees value in that you can generate revenue from. And of course, things like grants and partnerships. Who else has money that's looking to achieve the same outcome that can contribute to our resilience building investments? And just to sort of sum it up, here's an example of how this might work. Local government's got a goal of reducing stormwater flood risk, let's just say for 1,000 structures. Looking at it through kind of both lenses, spending your money differently and finding the new money somewhere else. If you're spending your money differently, you can just simply make the decision to invest in infrastructure that's going to encourage growth in high ground communities. If that's where I want development to occur to reduce our risk, then a lot of times private follows public. I'm going to invest in new infrastructure, new roads, what have you, in areas where I want to encourage new development. On the other side, finding new money somewhere else. On the savings side of that scale, stop allowing development in the floodplain. You're going to reduce your risk, your avoided losses again, your insurance premium, and having to go back and maintain infrastructure that's in an area where you don't want to encourage development. On the other side, you can find partners who can bring money to the table. In this example, a park system. If I want to reduce the risk for an area and I have a park system who's got a large footprint or otherwise wants a park in that area, how could that park be designed or retrofitted to provide flood storage? And then if that park system, has a revenue stream that goes along with it, either a fee to use the park or some dedicated assessment or tax that funds the park system, let's go out and find and sell green bonds in order to finance that project up front instead of having to pay as you go. So nothing new here. It's just a matter of how do I bake in and prioritize resilience into my funding decisions. Lastly, I'll just say for anybody who's interested, we're going to have a webinar on December 5th at 10 a.m. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into this. So thank you, and I look forward to continuing the discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mike. All right. Let's see, am I on here? All right. Fantastic. Thanks to all of our speakers. There were some amazing points you make. I want to dig into some of this, but there were some really interesting themes around weighted cost benefits analysis and how do you deal with the tensions inherent in paying for these things. I think repeatedly I heard the sort of tension around narrative and public will. I want to get into some of those conversations. Of course, this theme around equity and what does it mean for planners to be engaged and to really activate some of those conversations. Joe, you talked a lot about connecting the science and the engineering to decision making and really pushing us at the city level to think about innovation. And I want you to check in for a moment about what does it mean to develop the public will to pay for those things? How do you translate fairly complex engineering concepts to the public who can then maybe develop the strength and public will to push our leaders to behave and to maybe invest differently? And if you could also add in there, I'm cheating a bit, often the work that we do and the regulatory frameworks we work in assume land ownership and home ownership. We saw this in Katrina. We continue to see this in federal and state law. It's a real challenge for those of us who have an equity agenda. How are we adjusting for that in those conversations as well?
Okay.
That's a lot.
Well, it's not an easy process, right? Because getting everybody to agree to work together is always a problem. I think I was looking at those pictures from 100 years ago and thinking, like, how did they do that? And I guess they were just, much like New Orleans after Katrina, there was so much desperation, they needed to do something, right? And so, that made sense at that time and everybody bought into it. But it took them 8 years to raise Galveston. And today we've got so many different ways to express ourselves out into the community, and it just seems like it would be absolutely impossible to get everybody to agree to do one plan. And we're seeing in Miami Beach, Miami Beach is saying, their attitude towards sea level rise is let's just keep pumping more money into it because we've got really valuable real estate. And that's also a city that is confronted with issues of equity because you've got long-time residents that are not living by modest means. You've got restaurants and tourist industry where you've got young folks that can't afford to live close to where they're working. And so the last little bit of Miami Beach that is still somewhat kind of market rate affordable private affordable is getting pushed out for the kind of this drive. And so you've got a city that's just saying, we'll just raise the streets, and they're going full guns. They're not touching the private property, and so that's a community that has apartments at different strata of income, and so often the more affordable units are in the older buildings, the old historic buildings, and those are now their first floor is now below the FEMA base plane. So now the insurance that apartment building owner has to pay is so much crazy high that then at some point it's not going to pencil out, and either they're going to get evicted and the buildings will get torn down somehow, and so it's mostly like to get the information out there for the greater community we need better publicists because especially when we're the engineers and the technicians talking about it, we're not bringing it down to the level that the general community can understand, and that's the challenge.
Yeah. So I'm watching the clock, so I want to make sure we maybe do a little bit of speed round and see if we can still make space at the end here for maybe 1 or 2 questions. Katie, you talked a bit about, I really love this idea of moving from asset-based to systems thinking with regard to your resilience shift. And then you showed us the example of the research you were doing around equity-based community cost benefits analysis. What's the opportunity for those of us who are doing planning at the city level, who are doing actual implementation work or advocacy work, to push for more of that kind of analysis, and who can help us do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have the easy job of like just throwing the idea out there,
Yeah.
and I'm not the one actually implementing it in a lot of cases. But I think it's exactly that, of trying to turn some of these traditional tools that we're using on their head a little bit and figuring out how can we use the same tool but think about it differently, and just having that conversation. I think too often we sort of censor ourselves in what we think is actually feasible, and we don't actually throw out that bold idea or that different idea, and we're never going to be able to push beyond into actually trying something like that unless we start having those conversations with the people that can implement it and can change it. So that example that we used was actually coming out of an idea that one of my colleagues had who used to work at the Army Corps of Engineers, and they use that kind of traditional cost-benefit analysis in everything they do. Right. And what if, even if you don't do it yet on a project, what if you just take one of the projects that has already been done and apply that and just see what the results are, and see how that would have changed maybe the decision-making process, and then start to have that conversation build around that.
Chris, I see your hand up, and I'm dying just because of my own connection to transportation and transit strategy over here. I feel like you have maybe a potential answer to that question.
Well, you asked about concrete examples, and one of my colleagues, Jeff Tumlin, was for 9 months the interim director of the new Department of Transportation for the city of Oakland. We heard earlier today about Oakland and how it's been an integrated, or at least a multiracial city on the West Coast longer than almost any other city. They had a traditional transportation function that was buried inside the Department of Public Works, which is the worst place to have your transportation function, right? Because then it's run by people who have to worry about the important things like water and sewer systems and don't care so much about what happens at the surface with humans. So they broke out their transportation department based on some consulting we did for us, and then said, that was great, now come be the startup director of that department. And the first thing Jeff said was, okay, map your capital spending plan for the next 10 years on top of your patterns of disparate outcomes in health, education, safety, et cetera. And they said, well, we can't do that, we've never done that before. A month later, they had those maps and could have a public conversation about, are we using our capital budgets to redress is the wrong word, to address some of the existing patterns of disparate outcomes across our citizens? They were not. They changed that, and they were able to do that because of political leadership that wanted to see that information and use it in a very public way in decision making. Now, they then went on to do that with their operating budget as well, which, like most transportation departments, was somebody calls with a complaint, they go out and address the complaint. So instead of taking first come, first served, they said, all right, let's take first come, but let's look at how those are mapped across the city as well, and be sure to prioritize complaints or issues we know about that are in places where we have disparate outcomes. So within the span of 9 months, they changed the way they did capital and operating budgeting. Wow. And as Jeff points out, that was partly able to succeed because he knew he was only going to be there for 9 months, so he could take on the risk. Most bureaucracies, right, the bureaucrats, and I have been one before, want to keep their jobs, so they're not willing to take on that risk. So there's a real conversation to be had about how do we incentivize risk-taking like that in bureaucracies. That's a hard question, but it can be done.
And I appreciate your point about risk, because I actually wanted to ask Mark for a moment real quickly. You talked about risk, and I think many of us are interested in not only the risk analysis that we traditionally do, but how are we matching that with this notion of equity and the ability for people to be engaged in the risk analysis conversation? And how do you deal with that in political context? In every city, that's what we have to deal with.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm not sure I have the perfect answer.
Well, there we go. Somebody in the audience may have a question.
Starts with having good data. I think if you can back up what you're saying with good data, and trying to have the conversation with the people who are living with it every day. Not only will you hear about the challenges, but sometimes you'll hear about the solutions. I mean, people are adapting on their own all the time. I had the privilege of working on the LA Safe project here in the state of Louisiana, and we heard that and observed that so many times. These little nuggets of how this family changed the way they're living to be able to deal with the water that's rising in their community. I think the bigger nut that everybody, I say everybody who's a geek like me that's trying to figure this out, is trying to crack is, how do you capture the value up front of the risk reduction to come, right? If you implement these interventions, and it goes cost benefit analysis is a big part of it, but if you can capture what it's going to, the savings that you're going to get, or the value of the risk you're reducing, and can borrow against that up front to implement some of these, that's whoever comes to the table first with that solution, it's going to be very popular because that's something everybody's striving for.
That's really helpful. I want to maybe go for one audience question. I know time is running short, and we have been told to be very disciplined. We've had such rich presentations and answers. Is there anyone who has a question in the audience that we want to? Because if not, I will ask another question. Okay. So part of what I'm really interested in, I want to go back to this for any of you. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed it. Where are we? There she is. Great, thank you. Oh, troublemaker.
I have I am a troublemaker. I do have a transportation-centric question, and I recently spent some time abroad, and I was in Milan for a few days, and I was really taken aback by the totality and the multimodal nature of their transportation system. They had a regional rail, they had an underground subway, they had an above-ground light rail system, they had a streetcar, they had bus rapid transit, they had an extensive bike share system. I don't understand why we don't seem to have systems like that in place in America today. And it seems like we're very siloed off, even as we talk about transportation, right? People talk about bike share programs, people talk about, the people rail enthusiasts, right? But we don't talk about the all of the above approach as it pertains to transit. And so I suspect it has a lot less to do with cost and available resources and a lot more to do with culture and desire for those types of systems. And so I'm wondering what we can do today and into the future to begin to change our domestic culture more toward a multimodal approach.
This one.
Run for office? I mean, the decisions are ours to make, and the fact is we've been making them, the tide has certainly been changing in the last 20, 25 years. But for 50 years before that, we only really invested in, when it comes to transportation, we only invested in highways, right? We only invested in the interstates through our cities. But that can be history if we let it be history. And frankly, it's been productive for cities that the federal government has been funding, in general, less transportation, right? They've been providing less incentives to spend scarce state and local resources on highways. So as the funding pool has declined, there's a little less incentive to go after those easy federal dollars for highway building. So in many cases, our urban areas, and I know this is true in Louisiana, our states fight with our cities in most parts of the country. Cities want to invest in multimodal transportation solutions. In some cases, states are actively working to undermine that. So getting elected to state office and trying to change those policies at a state level is very important. At the federal level, I feel like it's come along, but there's still a lot of work to be done. But run for office. Yeah,
and I would quickly add, I think this cost issue is actually is an issue. It keeps people like myself who chair a transit authority, it keeps some of the folk that we partner with from having discussions about regionalism, cost sharing, and the ability to build these economies. So you can't get to vision because everyone is scared that there won't be enough resources to actually pay for it, right? So there is a bit of a chicken and egg conversation there. And as Chris said, run for office and set the narrative forth.
Can I just piggyback off that?
Yeah, there's, I think, one last comment, then
Sure.
I think we got to close
I
this
would,
thing up here, Mark. Yeah.
Similar to the question about, equity and how do you hear from, how people are dealing with it, I think the same can be said around transportation. If you get out there and you are in the communities where they don't have access to multimodal transportation, you'll see how people are adapting, working on a project in Lafayette, University Avenue corridor, and people are walking and biking and using their rascals and everything else on whatever bit of right-of-way or even private property that they can to get from point A to point B. So a lot of it's just a matter of providing the platform to get them the infrastructure that they need. The desire, there are stigmas, no doubt about it, but the desire, and a lot of times is there. It's just a matter of, talking to the users or the potential users, and once they determine that they want it and how they can get it, then you have a kind of the collective will to get it done.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, would you help me thank our panelists for this amazing conversation?